Good afternoon, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today at this important event. As an MP in a military seat and as a Shadow Defence Minister, I've long been an advocate for the charity and the work that you do to support our armed forces community across the country and support their families too, by highlighting an issue that, despite government being aware of for some time, is still prevalent today. I've heard firsthand the work of people like Anne, a lead nurse for the Armed Forces Project, and the real difference these efforts make to people's lives, including many in my own constituency of Portsmouth South. It's also no surprise that the project was shortlisted as a finalist in the Health Service Journal Awards in the Military and Civilian Partnership category, so huge congratulations for that. One of the tragedies of this disease is diagnosis only occurs 15 to 40 years after exposure to asbestos, the only known cause of the disease. Meanwhile, approximately 60% of people diagnosed will sadly die within a year of learning that they have the disease, with 3 years survival only at 10%. Prior to your incredibly important report commissioned by the charity and published last year, there was very little data on this issue. It's therefore helped to shine a spotlight and provide evidence of a disease that we've known for many years has had particular impacts on current and former service personnel. The work you do shows genuine leadership and makes a real difference, helping to secure change and support those impacted by the disease deserve. From that truly innovative report, we have learnt that there has been a total of 340 Armed Forces Compensation Scheme claims from people with the disease between April 2016 and March 2020, with the rate of claims on the rise in the latest available data. 87% of veterans from your study had been exposed to asbestos as a result of their military service, while only 13% exposed to asbestos in both military and civilian life. It also shows that it's likely that the case that members of our armed forces community contacted the disease because of their service, not in civilian life. We cannot allow for another generation of veterans to be exposed to conditions unnecessarily during their service that then leads in later life to being exposed with this dreadful disease. But of course, we also know from the findings that service personnel themselves struggle to speak up about the impact of the disease on both their physical and mental health, which in turn impacts on raising awareness and acquiring the compensation and other means of support that they deserve. That's why I believe the Armed Forces Project is so valuable, as while many veterans and service personnel may remain stoic on their experience of diagnosis, it means we must work as hard as we can to raise greater awareness of its impact. Despite some changes to the compensation scheme claims afforded by government in 2016, with your support I will continue to question ministers on this issue in Parliament and lobby on behalf of the armed forces community to ensure the support and change that is vitally needed. Thank you very much for what you're doing and keep up the good work.
Thank you, and I think you can hear from Stephen's words there how important this project really is for everybody. Portsmouth, where I'm actually based in our local district general hospital, we see around about 40 cases per year of mesothelioma. Doesn't sound a lot, but actually with it up and down the UK, that's quite a hotspot and very much based on our previous military history. So moving on, I'd like to introduce Liz Darlison, who is the CEO of Mesothelioma UK and nurse consultant at the University Hospital of Leicester. There wouldn't be a Supporting Our Armed Forces project without Liz, and her drive and determination, her passion and dedication to supporting mesothelioma patients is unerring. Liz is going to talk about how the project started and developed way beyond our initial expectations. Liz.
Liz Darlison. I'm the Chief Executive of Mesothelioma UK. I'm also a nurse consultant working at the University Hospitals of Leicester. And so I still work clinically with people living with mesothelioma. I'd like to share with you just a little bit of insight into some of the advocacy work that Mesothelioma UK is doing in support of our armed forces and our veterans. So We embarked on our Supporting Our Armed Forces project 4 years ago now, and we're very grateful to the Covenant Fund, which was then the Libel Fund, for supporting this work. We had a hunch as a team of nurses that there was an issue about mesothelioma amongst our veterans. The nurses, the Mesothelioma UK team of nurses were seeing a number of veterans diagnosed with mesothelioma, and at our regular networking meetings, it was brought up in discussion, and the nurses were concerned and they wanted to do something more to support those veterans. It wasn't just about learning more about mesothelioma in the veterans, it was also about educating ourselves about how better to support those veterans. So we made the application to the LIBOR funds and were granted a significant amount of money that enabled us to embark on what was meant to be a 3-year project, but ended up being a 4-year project for a variety of reasons. That project, Supporting Our Armed Forces, had 4 work streams. Those work streams were looking at developing information and support, bespoke information and support for the armed forces. It was about raising awareness of the dangers of asbestos amongst the armed forces and across the armed forces, but also about raising the profile and awareness of veterans within our NHS services. It was about building up relationships. We were very naive as a team of nurses and charity workers about the armed forces. A couple of the nurses have got some armed forces experience, but generally speaking, it was something that we were very naive about. So we really wanted to build up strong relationships with the armed forces community and really immerse ourselves and embed ourselves in that whole armed forces community. And then finally, and the biggest part of the project really, in terms of what the money was spent on, was conducting a rigorous piece of research to really capture the whole picture of what is going on with our armed forces and mesothelioma. And we worked with the Sheffield University team to complete that piece of research. So all in all, that took 4 years, and the findings from that research and from our work through those 4 work streams is what really has built our priorities for advocacy work going forward. So just to share those with you, I think first and foremost, what we wanted to do was really raise the profile amongst our mesothelioma clinical teams across the country, raise the profile of the veterans that we're seeing. Often people may do 3, 4, 5, 10 years service in one of our services, armed forces, and then go on to have a much longer career as a civilian, perhaps as an electrician or maybe teaching or any number of things. And so when people run into problems with their ill health and they turn up in our clinics, we often don't ever know that they've been in the armed forces, and we felt that was something that we needed to address. And so we really wanted to raise the profile of our veterans within our clinical teams. And so the charity now has 33 nurses, soon to be 35. And we've spent a lot of time, discussing this and educating the nurses, learning about the armed forces and looking at the evidence that we've gained from the research. And now what we do is we ask each of those nurses to always ask every patient, have you ever served in any of our armed forces? And if somebody says, yes, I did 4 years or 5 years or whatever, we just ask the nurses to take time to acknowledge that, to document it in the patient's clinical records, to show some gratitude or respect for that service. But then also to just talk about reconnecting that person with their armed forces roots. And for some people, that is, very welcome for the vast majority. And for others, it's not such a priority. But what we didn't realise was the enormity of support and information that is available to veterans. And so we now take some responsibility for sharing that with people that have served in the armed forces, even if they've only served for one day as a reservist, you know, they are still considered a veteran. And so we want to identify that, acknowledge it, and then make sure that our nursing team are equipped with information about the various armed forces services and support that is available for people, and then reconnect them appropriately. Longer term, of course, what we'd like to do is to have a ripple effect across all lung cancer teams, and then generally through all cancer teams, so that we could share what we have learned about how better to support our veterans with the wider cancer teams. So that's a longer term aim that we'd like to, in our advocacy for veterans, we'd like to really raise the profile of veterans across the NHS, particularly in cancer services. We also learned from the research that there are some sensitivities around supporting our veterans. Veterans, it would seem, prefer to be supported by other veterans. And we also know that, you know, in dealing with a health crisis, that can sometimes lift the lid on stress and anxiety, and even post-traumatic stress disorder that has resulted as a consequence of their service. So we'd also like to do a lot more work around that in educating our team of nurses, but then again, that ripple effect through cancer services. So a major project for us going forward, it's about really raising the profile of veterans across our nursing team, but then across all cancer services. We also would like to set up some kind of national nursing network for nurses that are working in armed forces roles and nurses working in the NHS with an interest in veterans. So we'd like to raise the profile of health conditions that veterans are more inclined to experience. So, and also help NHS nursing teams to be better equipped to support veterans as they enter their services. So we're not sure what form that's going to take. We know that mesothelioma is only a small part of the health conditions that veterans may experience, but we wanted to use that as a platform for just really uniting nurses to better support veterans using NHS services. Moving on, the other areas of advocacy that we're very keen to address is looking at the finance and benefits situation when you're diagnosed with mesothelioma. If you're a veteran diagnosed with mesothelioma and your exposure is as a consequence of your armed forces service, then navigating the benefit system is even harder than people who haven't been a veteran. There are a lot more opportunities or a lot more options available to you to explore. And veterans, we work very closely with Veterans UK and rely on them heavily. We also work very closely with the asbestos support group to continue to advocate and support veterans to navigate the benefits and legal systems to ensure that they get the best value out of the options available to them. But what we also found through our research was that veterans don't necessarily get equal access to some benefits and compensation. And we feel that's wrong. We think that it shouldn't matter whether you've been exposed in the armed services or whether you've been exposed as a civilian. We feel very strongly as a charity that our veterans should not be discriminated against in that way. So we're going to be working really hard to ensure that that we can campaign to make sure that that imbalance is redressed. And we're hoping to work with other charities to that end. Two other areas that we are keen to work on from an advocacy perspective. So we have been working very closely with the Ministry of Defence Health and Safety team. They have embarked on a whole strategy for managing and dealing with the asbestos legacy across all of the armed forces, been really impressed with how they have embraced our findings and have also stepped up to address some of our asks in terms of leading the way nationally in dealing with the asbestos legacy. So that's looking at the building stock across the armed forces and where asbestos is present and making sure that it's managed safely. It's about looking at all of the component parts used in the armed forces, identifying those that contain asbestos, replacing them with asbestos-free equivalents. And so we've been really impressed with the MOD health and safety team and how they have, as I say, approached the whole asbestos legacy across the armed forces. Another area that we'd really like to see them work on and that we're keen to support them with is about raising the awareness and education regarding all asbestos issues within the armed forces. For instance, we would like to see every medical recruit to the armed forces, whether that be doctor, nurse, healthcare assistant. We'd like every recruit to the armed forces to have specialist modules on asbestos, asbestos-related diseases, and mesothelioma to ensure that we raise the index of suspicion for asbestos-related diseases amongst the healthcare professionals working in the armed forces. We'd also, much the same as we'd like to see in education and in the NHS, we'd also like to see every person employed by the armed forces, whether that be in a civilian capacity or in either of our services, so whether that be the Army, RAF, Marines, Navy, we would like to see every person recruited into the armed forces or employed in any capacity by the armed forces have mandatory asbestos awareness. Just to make sure that people are aware that asbestos is still present in our society, not exclusively in the armed forces, it's everywhere in the UK, it's in our schools, it's in our hospitals, it's in our homes. But we really would like to ensure that anybody working in the armed forces is aware of that, is aware of the dangers, and aware that very subtle and casual levels of exposure can sadly result in a mesothelioma diagnosis. So that really is the sum total of what we would like to work on over the years and months ahead. So looking at finance and benefits, looking at asbestos education and awareness, looking at raising the profile of our veterans across the NHS, using our areas of influence to really meet the needs of our veterans more effectively and to reconnect them with their roots. And of course, we can do a certain amount of this within Mesothelioma UK's responsibilities. We are desperately seeking ongoing funding. The grant that we had from the Covenant LIBOR monies finished in September last year, September 2020, and we've managed to retain some of the work thanks to our partnership working with the Hampshire Asbestos Support and Awareness Group, HASAG, but also from some core mesothelioma funding that we've managed to identify that can support that. But it really is on a shoestring at the minute. So going forward, in order for us to address all of these issues and to work more in partnership and to try and influence the agenda going forward, we have to secure funding and ring-fence funding for our armed forces advocacy work. So we in the operational team are working hard to try and secure that funding. But what I can say is that we never expected to really find so much that needs addressing through our research and through our supporting our armed forces project. We're absolutely committed to our veterans. If we can't get it right for people who have served our community and our country in the way that our veterans have, then we feel that we're failing. And so we are absolutely committed to doing all that we can to support our armed forces and our veterans. And hook or by crook, we will secure that funding. So with that, I would like to close and to thank the MESA UK team for putting together our armed forces event. And I would like to just say thank you to our armed forces and our veterans, and to really celebrate all that our armed forces are and all that they do on behalf of our country and our communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sure you'll agree that's a real good roundup of the project so far. We really have exceeded what we expected, and we have so much more to do. So we very much are still trying to secure funds to take this project forward, but we are committed to doing what we can with what we've got so far. So before our next presentation, I'd like to share a short video with you. It was made by the British Forces Broadcasting Service, the FBS, who have been very interested in the work that we've been doing, and have engaged with our clinical nurse specialist at Southampton on different projects. But a very short video about the risk of asbestos in the military.
Mesothelioma isn't a disease likely to rear its head during service. It's later in life it's more likely to strike.
Left! Turn!
431 veterans have made claims for compensation for it from the MOD in the last 4 years. It's an asbestos-related terminal cancer. 2,700 new cases of it are diagnosed in the UK each year. The majority of those affected are men over 65.
Mesothelioma is a cancer. It's a cancer of mesothelial cells that are found in our covering and lining tissue in our body's main cavities, so your chest cavity and your abdominal cavity. It's far more common to get mesothelioma of your chest, and it's in the lining of the chest cavity, which is called the pleura. The only known cause of mesothelioma is exposure to asbestos, and unfortunately the UK has the highest incidence of mesothelioma in the world.
A study carried out by Mesothelioma UK and the University of Sheffield estimates between 80 and 100 veterans die of the disease every year. And it concludes they aren't just from the Royal Navy, a previously held belief. It's a disease that affects all 3 services. But it also found veterans face some unique issues after diagnosis.
The challenges for veterans with mesothelioma is trying to navigate both civilian processes alongside military processes. So actually that difficulty trying to work out, for example, compensation schemes, which one they're eligible for, which one would be better for them to apply for, and how to go about that. And I think so the importance of taking a good occupational history is really crucial here. So it needs to be somebody who understands both mesothelioma, but also understands the military.
And researchers found veterans felt there was an issue around the fairness of civilian versus military compensation schemes.
What they were seeing was a lump sum scheme through the military where you can get the maximum of £140,000. So that seems like a lot of money. However, they were also hearing about people being awarded civilian compensation, and we're often seen to get a higher financial award. The other thing is that there is capacity through the civilian scheme for people to have finance made available for treatment, which is not available on the NHS. That isn't the same in the military system.
Having to sort of fight for your treatment in a way that a civilian wouldn't have to was obviously very challenging for the veteran. And one half was, really angry that they weren't able to access this non-HS funded treatment in the same way that a civilian might be able to. And on the other side, there was that loyalty to the MOD and saying, well, you know, it is very expensive.
The Ministry of Defence has issued a statement following the report saying, "The health and safety of serving personnel and veterans is of the utmost importance. Veterans can access health and financial support through the Veterans Welfare Service, including guidance for claiming compensation available through the War Pension Scheme. The standard of proof required is far lower than its equivalent civilian scheme. We also are continuing to safely reduce the presence of asbestos historically used across the estate and have robust training to help personnel securely deal with any risk of exposure." The report's authors hope their findings will help deliver a better service to veterans suffering from the disease. Claire Sadler, Forces News.
So there's a brief summary of the research study that we undertook with the University of Sheffield. But to build further on that, I'd like to invite Stephanie Ejegi-Memeh, who is a research associate at the University of Sheffield, to explain a little bit more about the findings of the MIMES study and how it has actually gone on to influence policy going forward.
Hello, my name is Stephanie Ejegi-Memeh and I'm a researcher at the Mesothelioma UK Research Centre. Today I will present key messages from the Military Mesothelioma Experience Study, or what we call the MIMES. I'm here on behalf of the MIMES research team led by Professor Angela Todd. So this project was sorely needed. The UK has the highest incidence of mesothelioma in the world, with 2,700 cases diagnosed each year. The incidence of mesothelioma among UK military veterans remains unknown. We do, however, know that 8 veterans per month are claiming war pension due to a diagnosis of mesothelioma. And more importantly, little is known about the specific support needs of veterans living with mesothelioma and how we can ensure that care is tailored to their needs. The aims of the project were to first explore evidence regarding the incidence and prevalence of mesothelioma among British Armed Forces veterans. The second aim was to understand the experience of health and support needs of British Armed Forces veterans with mesothelioma. And the third aim was to identify how health professionals, legal professionals, and support agencies within the Armed Forces and NHS can best meet the care and support needs of British Armed Forces personnel with mesothelioma. Mixed methods were used to address these aims. So the quantitative methods were descriptive statistics derived from 3 data sources. So first, records of claims for the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme. Second, the Supporting Our Armed Forces database. And third, the Mesothelioma UK survey, so the MORE survey. Descriptive analysis took place using Excel and SPSS. For the qualitative arm of the study, data collection, participants were recruited via Meso UK and asbestos support groups. Telephone interviews and face-to-face interviews took place between December 2018 and September 2018 and September 2019. We interviewed 13 veterans, 1 person living with mesothelioma, 10 family members, and 8 health, legal, and military professionals. The ages of participants range from 61 to 89 years, their length of service spanned from 2 to 34 years, and time since diagnosis ranged from 3 weeks to 4 years. Thematic analysis was used to analyse the data. 8 key messages have been devised from the findings. Each will now be considered in turn. So our first key message is to challenge assumptions regarding who has been exposed to asbestos while in the armed forces and raise awareness of the risk of such exposure. The findings indicate that there are assumptions regarding who is at risk of asbestos exposure and why. For example, naval servicemen working on ships being the predominant high-risk group. While naval personnel are at high risk of asbestos exposure, MIMES indicates that other service personnel are also at risk. The 2 quotes below the table show non-naval veterans coming into contact with asbestos through cleaning responsibilities and accommodation while serving in the military. Exposure was sometimes low-level and short-term from working and living environments. The nature of asbestos exposure amongst our participants varied enormously. Increased awareness is required to reduce exposure in the future and promote early diagnosis. The second key message is that occupational history taking requires skill and sensitivity for patients with an armed forces background. Identifying the source of asbestos exposure during military service may be difficult and requires the help of someone with expertise and experience. Sensitivity is required, and this is especially true for people who have experienced combat or trauma during their military career, as a diagnosis may trigger additional emotional distress. And dual exposure is also an important aspect. So some veterans were exposed to asbestos both in military and civilian life, and this has implications for seeking compensation. The third key message is that veterans' stoic approach may disguise their physical and emotional needs. So many veterans appeared stoic in the face of a diagnosis of mesothelioma. Participants made comparisons between challenging experiences whilst serving in the armed forces and living with mesothelioma. These memories drove them to proactively cope with rather than be subdued by their mesothelioma diagnosis. Maintaining an image that projected the appearance of physical and mental strength and independence was valued. Participants communicated the belief that they were responsible for themselves and they did not like to be a burden to others. Fourth key message is that veterans require access to experts with experience of navigating the relevant health, legal, and military systems. If veterans do not access the right information at the right time, this can have significant health and financial implications. Applying for compensation and information about access to support requires professional with experience of working with veterans. And we had a lot of good things about HSJ down on the South Coast as an important organisation to link up with. This works best when organisations work in partnership across settings. In cases where there was clear communication between Veterans UK, clinical nurse specialists and asbestos support groups, this ensured that the patient received high quality care in terms of information and compensation in a timely manner. The fifth key message is that it's important to recognise and understand the perspectives and support needs of family members. So family members are often omitted from studies of veterans' experience. Our findings show that family members form an important part of the veteran's experience of living with mesothelioma. They are key to supporting the veteran and helping them to access support when necessary. However, due to a background valuing independence and self-reliance, they may have difficulty asking for help in a timely manner. The impact of a mesothelioma diagnosis on military family members remain unknown, and more research is required in this area. Our sixth key message is that veterans living with mesothelioma may prefer to support and be supported by other veterans. Maintaining independence can be a priority for veterans, and this can mean that it's challenging for them to ask for help. Our findings suggest that some prefer receiving support from other veterans who they see as being a part of the same military family. While veterans often avoided discussing their own physical and emotional needs, they also expressed a sense of responsibility for caring for other veterans. The strong bonds that were formed from the shared military experience was important to many participants. The shared history facilitated connection, communication, and trust. This meant that some participants sought support from other veterans and were keen to provide support also. Veterans may have a preference for other veterans to support their emotional needs regardless of the specific health conditions. Generic veterans organisations may therefore have an important role to play in supporting veterans. Mesothelioma UK has an existing Facebook group dedicated to armed forces personnel, veterans and their families. Our seventh key message is that some veterans see inequalities between their experience of living with mesothelioma and that of civilians. So several veterans, family members and staff highlighted perceived inequalities between veterans and civilians living with mesothelioma. The experience of claiming compensation came up frequently. The amount of compensation received can be smaller and is not index linked, and this was a source of inequality for veterans. Another perceived inequality that was highlighted included reduced access to non-NHS funded treatment. A third perceived inequality was the inability for families to pursue a claim once the veteran had passed away, and this was also considered unfair. So these inequalities really frustrated participants, and some felt that the duty of care had not been fulfilled by the military. The final key finding that we present is that there was a lack of awareness regarding asbestos exposure in the armed forces, and also concern about ongoing asbestos risk. So although some participants shared in-depth knowledge of their exposure to asbestos, some even anticipating their diagnosis after learning about the diagnosis of asbestos-related diseases of fellow servicemen, several staff participants described a lack of awareness and shock amongst veterans diagnosed with amongst veterans diagnosed with mesothelioma. Alongside this, data from veterans, family members and staff participants showed anger and concern that asbestos can still be found on some military premises and buildings. So this presents an ongoing risk to military personnel. Okay, so those are the 8 key findings that I'll be presenting today from the mines. We're in the process of sharing our findings through publications and conferences. And we've also developed 4 pen portraits. So these have each been designed for use as an educational resource for professionals working with veterans with a mesothelioma diagnosis and their families. You can see an example of that as Adam in the middle. And you know, just kind of a quick point to end on that. Sometimes in research, what can happen is that these wonderful projects are undertaken and some really important findings are discovered, but then it ends there. There's no real world impact. However, well, you know, the great thing about this project is that and the wider Supporting Our Armed Forces project, which is led by Liz Darlison, is that the dissemination work and dedication to ensuring that the findings from the mines have practical and positive impact for veterans and their families have been astounding. The Supporting Our Armed Forces project recently won an HSJ Award, recognising the important work that has been undertaken and continues to be undertaken to change policy and practice. So the findings are informing service development. So in terms of next steps, it's important to note that our work is ongoing. One of our team members, Virginia Sherborne, is a PhD student looking at the psychological effects of mesothelioma in the UK military context from the carer's perspective. Virginia has completed data collection and is now analysing the data and writing up her thesis. She has published a peer-reviewed paper and has submitted evidence to the Parliamentary Defence Select Committee inquiry. And all of this work now sits under the Mesothelioma UK Research Centre, Sheffield. This Mesothelioma UK funded centre was launched in November 2020 by Professor Todd and Dr. Gardner. If you'd like to know more about the work that we are doing or be added to the mailing list, please do get in touch. We'd be delighted. My contact details are on the next slide. And just to end, I'd really like to thank everybody who made this study and the wider project possible. So that includes our funders, the Supporting Our Armed Forces team, all of our names are down there, and especially our lovely participants who gave their time. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. And what we tend to find going forward with projects such as the Armed Forces project is that one research study leads to another. I'm sure that the work there, even with Virginia's work, will not be the last that we do in this area. So moving on, I would like to introduce you to Phil Hall, who is a Clinical and Medical Services Clinical Case Manager at Help for Heroes. One of the biggest parts of this project has been collaborating with other people who are involved in veterans' healthcare. And Phil certainly has been incredibly valuable to us as a resource, pointing us in the right direction. Phil is going to this afternoon give us an insight into nursing in the armed forces and his work with veterans. Phil.
Sorry, I had to wait to be unmuted. Sorry about the pregnant pause. Firstly, thank you for inviting me today, and also thanks to Liz as well. Liz and Anne have been doing some incredible work for veterans, and a little bit about myself and my background, I suppose, and why I ended up working for Help Heroes and doing the job that I'm doing currently. I spent 26 years in the armed forces as a pre-hospital trauma nurse, and my experience really relates to more recent times. In fact, there was an article in the Telegraph about 2 or 3 months ago saying God bless the soldiers that joined the army in 1991, what a busy time they had. And it was really a reflection leading up to Armed Forces Day at the weekend, this weekend. And it was one of the MPs that had been from the Tony Blair years that was talking about Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Afghan, Iraq, Northern Ireland. And I felt very gracious because I joined the army in 1991 and had the pleasure of touring all those places. So what I'd like to kind of talk about today is really how being in the armed forces and the generation that I was in the armed forces, so it's a particular period of time, so 1991 to 2016, how busy it was and why it's so complicated for healthcare workers today to really engage with those members of the armed forces. So firstly, I think if we took ourselves back 50 years, maybe 60 years, I could guarantee if I asked the audience to put their hands up, anybody whose dad, granddad, brother, daughter, son was in the armed forces, the majority of the audience would put their hands up. Thankfully, we didn't have Zoom back then, so they had a simpler life. But the reason for that is because within our past generations, there's been a very close connect to your armed forces. It's usually been somebody very close within your family. And as we've gone on through generations, thankfully, we live in a slightly less war-orientated world, so we don't have the big world wars. So people aren't generally as affected by what the armed forces is doing today and tomorrow. I'm sure most of us have seen the news in the last 24 hours about the Royal Navy ship that was being buzzed by the Russians. Now, for most people, that is a very distant piece. You probably haven't got many relatives that are sat on board that ship, and it's hard to actually understand what impact that is having on those young men and women that were sitting in that boat, not knowing if they're all about to die. But if you can think about that just for a second, that just puts you on the emotional roller coaster that members of our armed forces go through most days when they're operational. I certainly came through a long period in the armed forces, and the majority of my time was spent in the Middle East, so between Afghan and Iraq, working in both the military hospitals and out in the in Sangam Valley and the places such as that. And I saw firsthand the effect of young men trying to kill young men. And predominantly my role was trying to save young men that were trying to kill young men. It didn't really matter what side you're on, because I was lucky enough to be a nurse. So my role wasn't actually the killing, mine was picking up the pieces afterwards. But the long-term effect that it's having on those young men today is really important. And I think the NHS has grown so far away from the armed forces over the past 20, 30 years, it's sometimes hard to engage them and to ask that very simple question, were you ever a veteran? And why is that so important? Well, we've heard in the research that once you identify somebody as a veteran, there is certain support that they can get. And also it's about recognizing that service that they did. And I quite often talk to GPs around this subject about asking, have you ever served? And I'm quite grateful. I know the work that Mesothelioma have been adding to this. It's about raising awareness of veterans within the NHS. And I talk to NHS England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland pretty much monthly now and sit on their cultural understanding because there is a culture around the armed forces. We very rarely see soldiers, ex-soldiers, sailors, airmen that'll put their hands up and ask for help. In fact, they'll very rarely go straight to their doctor if they're feeling unwell. There's a number of reasons for this. Sometimes they're scared. Sometimes it's because no one's given them permission to do so. And when they were in the armed forces, it was always permission driven. You had to ask your corporal or your sergeant major if you were allowed to go sick on that day. So there's a certain culture around access to healthcare, whether that's primary healthcare or secondary healthcare. And my role now is about raising that awareness around the NHS to give them that experience and knowledge of what armed forces are currently doing and how veterans have been affected either in the short term, so the group that I particularly work with, or long term, they're the guys that maybe left the military a few generations before mine. So my work currently is working with very seriously injured veterans, and it's I would like to say it's an honour, but it's not an honour at all. It's an awful job, and I wish I didn't have to do it, if I'm completely honest. I'm looking after the men and women that were injured in Afghan and Iraq predominantly, and they were severely injured, so they require 24-hour care. And my role is to provide a link into the NHS. Now, it's quite a small group and it's constantly shrinking because unfortunately they do have quite a high mortality rate. But I'm currently supporting about 50 men and women that've got severe brain injury, tetraplegic, paraplegic, that struggle day to day. And it's about engaging the NHS with this group and ensuring that they do get the support that not only they should get, but I quite often say they deserve to get. One of the areas that I'm really interested in from this study, and I'm sure Annie's right, I'm sure this will impact other studies, is that ripple effect that we talked about. It's a ripple effect of other healthcare groups picking up on this veteran group and seeing if we can help support those veterans to maintain their health and fitness, but also to access help at an earlier point. And I'm quite pleased we've managed to generate that knowledge and that want to learn more about that veteran community and to identify them, and that we've managed to at least attempt to see what MOD have to say about it. Because MOD is a big service, sometimes hard to crack open that door, but I think with Anne and Liz and their contacts, they've managed to do that extremely well, and hopefully that will benefit service personnel today. One of the areas that we talked about, it's been brought up in this presentation on a number of occasions already, and that's around humanistic nursing. So this is the understanding that the patient sat in front of you isn't just there because they've got a bad knee. They've got a whole wealth of past experiences that you need to consider when you're looking at the bad knee, and that is, were they in the military? Did they run around 100 miles an hour? Did they get shot? Did they get blown up? It's all those elements within that person's life that gives you the patient that's sat in front of you. And it's that humanistic approach that's really important to the veteran, because that's giving them that recognition for their service, but also the understanding going forwards with their treatment plan. And there's influences not just from veterans, but there's a wider influence into men's health with this, because although we know there's men and women in the armed forces, predominantly there was a lot more men than women, and it's interesting some of the lessons that we're learning within the veteran community and how that can relate to men's health. So I do feel there's a wider aspect of support that we can offer across men's health, so not just veterans' health. And I think that impact is something that we'll hopefully crack as we move into the future. But thank you very much for your work. I think it's really impressive how you've managed to get MOD to listen to you. That is absolutely a massive pat on the back for that. And hopefully we can continue this work and this partnership.
Phil, thank you. And I'm sure Liz would join me in thanking you for your help. The resources you've been able to point us towards have certainly contributed a great part to us being able to push those doors open. So thank you. And obviously we will continue to liaise with each other, I'm sure. So the final part of this afternoon's programme really is to highlight something that we're all so very passionate about, and that's a memorial to the veterans who have contracted mesothelioma through their service. I've got a very short presentation about the memorial itself, which we'll look at first, and then perhaps I'll just say a few more words afterwards.
As we heard from Liz earlier this afternoon, the Mesothelioma UK Supporting Our Armed Forces project has been really successful at raising the awareness of asbestos exposure amongst service personnel and veterans. As a further fitting tribute to those that have contracted mesothelioma in this way, we have commissioned a sculpture to be sited at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. The sculpture will consist of 60 blocks of Ancaster weatherbed limestone. This hard-wearing, durable, mainly light brown with some blue hue stone also contains particles of tiny fossils that are reminiscent of asbestos. Each block will be inscribed with wording that describes the history of asbestos use in the UK, but also to commemorate those that contracted mesothelioma through their service. So how can you help? We understand that there is a lot of pressure to donate to charities in this current climate, but we would like to take this opportunity to ask for your help. We are over halfway towards the total that we need to site this memorial at the Arboretum. I cannot stress enough that any amount that you would like to give would be a help towards seeing this memorial come to fruition. If you would like to sponsor one of the blocks, perhaps in personal recognition of someone, the cost is £500. But again, please let me stress that any donations are very welcome. If you feel that you can donate to the memorial, you could either call the information line on 0800 169 2409 or access the Mesothelioma UK Armed Forces Memorial page on the Mesothelioma UK website. Or please feel free to contact me, at amoylan@nhs.net. Thank you, and I very much look forward to seeing you at the unveiling of the memorial at the Arboretum in the not too distant future. As we heard from Liz earlier this afternoon.
Oops, technical problems abound. Thank you, and thank you for listening. I do know that a lot of charities are asking for funding at the moment, but I do feel that this memorial would be such a fitting tribute to the veterans that have contracted mesothelioma in this way. A lot of thought has gone into the memorial and what it should look like. So if there is anybody in the audience that's got any idea of how we could publicise this, it does go out on our social media very regularly. But of course, you know, this current climate is difficult for everybody. We are really proud of what the project has achieved. And I think this would just be such a fitting way to kind of memorialise the whole of the project in a way. Winning the Health Service Journal Award in March was so amazing. We were up against some very stiff competition and we really, you know, didn't expect to win it. We weren't able to celebrate perhaps in the way that we would normally, but everybody has worked really hard. It's been an absolute pleasure working with the team that have been involved in the project. If any of you do have any questions or would like to contact us about anything that you've heard today, please do either contact the Mesothelioma UK helpline on 0800 169 2409 or have a look at the website at the Armed Forces page and have a look at what kind of the other bits and pieces that haven't been mentioned this afternoon. With that, I'd like to draw the afternoon to a close and thank you all very much for attending and for listening. As I say, please do not hesitate to contact me either on the website, the helpline, or on my email, amoylan@nhs.net. Thank you.